Chris, good morning.
Good
It's
morning.
really a pleasure to meet with you in London this time and to have this discussion about your very interesting experience in the anthrax case you had when you were in charge of Royal Mail. Just perhaps some words about who you are, what you did, and then we could go into this special case.
Thank you, Patrick. Well, I worked for Royal Mail for about 30 years as a mail operator, and for the last part of that I was head of network, which was basically in charge of all the things that linked all the Royal Mail units up to make them into a system. With that went leadership of emergency operational planning and crisis management, and therefore a very large theme of about the last 18 months of my career until I left last May was the leadership of the response from Royal Mail to the threats posed following the anthrax attacks in the United States in the autumn of 2001. And now I work as a consultant for the UK Department of Trade and Industry on those very kinds of subjects.
So if I remember, it was the 16th of October that suddenly you are informed that there was some problem in Liverpool.
That's right. We were already aware that something was happening in the United States, and perhaps it might be helpful just give a small amount of detail about that. Between mid-September and early October 2001, something like 8 letters containing anthrax were posted in New Jersey to various destinations in the United States in 2 waves. First to a set of media headquarters, and secondly to a couple of United States senators. The second wave contained a much more dangerous form of anthrax spores because they were much more finely milled down and spread much more severely. Following that, there were 22 cases of anthrax reported in the United States and 5 deaths. An enormous disruption to the United States Postal Service. Several major installations had to be completely shut down and were not cleaned up for years. Low levels of anthrax were found in a huge number of other locations which needed to be cleaned up. Business fell, confidence in the mail as a medium fell, the expenses were enormous. Obviously, not all of that falls into insignificance compared with the deaths, but it was a tremendous disruption. Following that, almost immediately, as you say, in our case, the 16th of October is the key date, almost every postal administration in the First World started getting incidents which became known as white powder incidents. Something spilled on the floor. What is it? We don't know what it is. As far as we know, at this stage, it could be anthrax. And Royal Mail, for example, between then and the beginning of February, recorded 500 incidents of that nature. So as well as dealing with those, the issue which always had to be faced was, well, what happens if there is a real attack? What happens if one of those really contains anthrax? I think probably a point is worth emphasising is just how confusing, messy, difficult this was, and how little we knew. Because this wasn't the kind of crisis where there is an immediate focus. There was no explosion, there was no flood, there was no fire. It very subtly, over a period of weeks, emerged that there was a major problem as the material literally seeped through the United States postal system. It's not a disease where people are immediately affected. There's an incubation period. People were presenting with symptoms over a long period. We in the United Kingdom or in Europe had no idea whether this was a United States phenomenon fact, no one's actually been arrested for the crime, so we still don't know exactly what the origin was. It was only a couple of weeks after 9/11, so there was an obvious connection with Al-Qaeda. I don't believe it's true, but that was an assumption one could not dismiss at that stage. And there was a great deal of lack of understanding of the nature of the problem, what was happening in the United States. They did magnificently in trying to disseminate information through the postal world, but initially, of course, they just didn't know themselves what was going on. And I think above all, it was a threat outside the experience of all postal managers. Postal managers, at least in the UK, grow up with the threat of a letter bomb. How to deal with it, how to deal with a suspicious item is ingrained, it's embedded. People do the right thing because of long training and long instinct. This was entirely outside of our experience. So I suppose the next question is, well, what do we do?
We don't know what we do.
So we had to adopt a very much a multi-layered, multi-time-scaled approach. And I suppose the point about the last few sentences that I said was, this is inevitably going to sound a bit more rational and a bit more clear-cut than it actually was. I mean, inevitably, that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to impose some pattern on the situation and deal with it. But this is probably going to sound a little bit more clear-cut than it actually was. I suppose 5 or so major items which we had to deal with. First, in terms of immediacy, was what are we going to do about all these white powder incidents? How to handle them internally, and perhaps more important than anything else, how to build up protocols with the police, with the health authorities, with the other emergency services, who were also finding their way in the fog as we were, because they didn't know anything about it either. So we had several iterations to get to a protocol about this is the way it will be dealt with, and to build up those relationships was absolutely crucial, with particularly the police in terms of handling incidents and getting a consistent response from the UK Police Service. A particular issue is that UK local police forces are operationally independent, so it takes an awful lot of work to get them to respond in a common way. And it has taken a huge amount of work, which is still ongoing, to embed the correct responses to this kind of incident, so that all of the thousands of managers across the postal service, all of the thousands of junior police commanders who might be involved, all react correctly, all react in a consistent way. I think the next thing, was probably the most important, but was creating a management process. We took a view that we would play it in a very simple, very direct way. One clear leader within the business at below board level, which was me, with a remit which was very clear to do whatever was necessary to address this issue, with a direct line through cutting through all of the layers to a nominated board member. We decided to use our existing crisis management process but enhance it, as opposed to trying to create something new, and that worked in my view extraordinarily well. It involved government to a huge extent, and normally the relationships between Royal Mail and the Department of Trade and Industry are somewhat formal, somewhat guarded. Both bodies, almost without thinking, took a decision that said, no, this is not appropriate for this thing. We will establish a direct line at operational level between the Royal Mail and the DTI, through me on the Royal Mail side and through the equivalent on the
DTI?
Sorry, Department for Trade and Industry, which is the sponsoring ministry of Royal Mail in the UK. And through them, we could build up the relationships with other government agencies who needed to be involved in terms of the Home Office for the security issues, the Department for Health, and so on and so forth. We brought those parties, both Royal Mail and government and the trades unions and the regulatory authority, together in a steering group which met pretty frequently, or not daily as our crisis management group did, and has gradually obviously has continued in existence, but has lengthened out the periods between its meetings because there's a different kind of need. But in that steering group, we were able to pull together everybody who was interested, coordinate their contributions, make sure everybody was on side. The trades unions, for example, played a very positive, very responsible role with a very difficult remit. On one side, to represent the very legitimate fears of their members, but on the other, to prevent a panic and a collapse of the system. The most critical issue was understanding, and the word I've come to use, envisioning the threat. This is new. What does it actually mean? And I think the most critical question was asked by actually a member of the United Kingdom Health and Safety Executive on about day 2. And that was, do we understand how this material works, how it behaves in a postal environment? Answer, no. The second most critical action, in fact, was done by the Royal Mail Head of Health and Safety, who put some powder of about the similar specification into an envelope and said, do you realise this leaks? So very, very quickly, and with a huge amount of cooperation from everybody, we set up some experiments in the UK postal environment with volunteer workers to put a safe biological equivalent of anthrax and a propellant into some envelopes and run them through postal machinery. What we found was that there's huge leakage even out of an envelope which is sealed around the edges, which contaminates the machinery, other letters, the operators of the machines, and was everything in the environment. So we're not dealing with a problem, if it had been real, which was, here is an item which has gone like so through the postal system, so track that route, and that is what you deal with. What you actually have to deal with is a huge expansion of mainly low-grade contamination over huge parts of the system, because the next letter to the contaminated letter, which is contaminated as the material is forced out through all the rollers and things that are in a modern piece of postal machinery, could be going anywhere. And that gelled with the pragmatic experience which was then starting to emerge from the United States, where they were finding low-grade contamination basically all over the country east of the Mississippi. People being affected by anthrax who were apparently nowhere near the track of the items, which was basically between New Jersey and New York and New Jersey and Washington. So sadly, one of the deaths was a poor old lady in Connecticut. No. But our experimental evidence met with their pragmatic experience. So we now had a clear understanding of what we had to deal with. And that was probably the most crucial issue, and I take no credit for the fact there was two other people who had that flash of inspiration that says, let's ask this question, or even let's try it, in a very so office-bound way, but it sent us in the right direction. The next point which very strongly came through to me was the need to manage perceptions as well as the reality. As we had 150,000 very confused, very concerned operatives, a huge customer base which was equally worried, confused, concerned. Can I accept a letter from abroad? Can I accept a letter from the United States? And they had perceptions which had to be dealt with, whether or not they accorded with reality. Number of ways of dealing with that. First issue was communicate. Brief, and be completely honest, including I don't know. We don't know what's happening in the United States. We'll keep you informed. Physical gestures were very, very important. We made protective equipment like gloves available. In reality, because the most dangerous form of anthrax is pulmonary anthrax, which is what you breathe in, gloves don't have a great deal of help. But as a gesture, as a symbol that the employer cared, the employer was trying to do what they could, it had a tremendous effect. The take-up was very, very low and died very, very quickly. But that kind of physical gesture, physical symbol, was extremely important in building confidence. And as I've mentioned, we involved the trades unions from day one. We treated them as equal partners, and they played a very key role in this terribly, terribly difficult balance between meeting people's quite legitimate fears and concerns and keeping the service going in an environment where, in the end, so far, there has not been an anthrax attack in the United Kingdom. Finally, of the five, we had to face up to the issue of what would happen if one of these incidents is real. And we had to create a roadmap of how we dealt with it. And the first draft was one sheet of paper with a lot of boxes on it, from which obviously we developed and created a very comprehensive plan, very multifaceted, involving all the specialisms within Royal Mail, outside Royal Mail, and particularly trying to specify the contacts and the relationships. Many aspects, a huge people management aspect, which obviously includes the medical, security element. If there's an incident, if there's a crime, you have to treat things as a crime scene and so on. An operational aspect with many aspects, both local and national. It's a technical issue, and perhaps more important than anything else, communications planning for the various audiences, the employees, customers, media, and so on and so forth. Since then, we've obviously developed that plan. It's now into many editions. It's very large, although we've tried to keep it into such a structure that no one individual has to relate to very much, just has to relate to an overall framework and one segment, which is not too long, because otherwise it becomes useless. The other thing we found was that whilst we needed a completely new framework, because this was a new problem, we tried to design a lot of our operational contingency planning to be, in fact, multi-use. So issues like, if we lose the use of a particular unit for whatever reason, this is what will happen. And rather than tying that into something which was limited to, say, a power failure or a flood or a fire or a strike or whatever. And what we found we could do is have the new framework but rearrange quite a lot of the existing bricks so that we could create the plan much quicker than otherwise we would have done.
You use the concept of granular.
Yes, yes. One of my
I think it's very pretty.
yes, one of my little nostrums is try and keep your planning granular, so that each little bit is fairly small, and you can fit it into a new pattern, into a new mosaic, if you need to. It perhaps applies particularly to something like a postal system where you have a very large number of units, and providing you keep your planning for each unit at that granular level that says, okay, if I lose this delivery unit, this is what I'm going to do. You can then fit that concept into all kinds of patterns. It may not apply to all industries, it depends on what your circumstances are, but certainly it's something I've found very, very useful. Beyond the sort of 5 immediate areas, obviously it is ongoing activity. Developing the understanding of the science, developing further capabilities, for example, the ability to test for biological agents, and considering ongoing protection measures for which there is technology available, but there's a huge cost-benefit issue. I was used to draw a little triangle that said, on one side of the triangle is, based on current experience, a very low probability of anything happening, which we hope will continue. The next side is a huge cost if it does happen, and on the other side is a huge cost of the preventative measure. So where do you go within that? I think the next point to emphasise is it is an ongoing threat. It's almost emerging still, and there is a need to keep focused, to keep things fresh, to keep it on the agenda. There is a need to learn as things evolve. There is this need to maintain priority, and it is never ending. To address that, we've continued the management process, now formalised the activity into a series of work plans so that there is a schedule by which people need to work, and that does keep some emphasis on it. The management of incidents is still involving both the internal and the external agencies. I think one thing that came very strongly home to me was it was much, much harder to embed these kinds of reactions than certainly I originally thought. It's taken a great deal more effort, which is still ongoing, to make sure that the correct responses, which are quite simple, are taken by every manager who might be exposed to this in every situation. The plan itself has evolved and changes as the understanding grows, and one area that needs to be developed is moving from a pure anthrax, if you like, emphasis on a particular biological agent, to something which is wider and deals with what's in the jargon called CBRN, chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear. In the United States they add an E on the end and make it CBRN, which is explosive, to make it a much wider plan, which is again more generic, more capable of being adapted to different kinds of threats. Okay, so we had a plan. Well, do we know it worked? Well, you'll never really know, and you don't want this to happen until there's a real incident, but you can test it. And we had a number of exercises which went under the banner of called Vectura, which my people tell me is Latin for postal service, where we got together large groups of people from all of the specialisms within Royal Mail and outside who were going to be involved in such an incident, and did a variety of walk-through exercises just to say, well, does this hang together? And it's quite extraordinary, the spin-offs which you get. During the first exercise, for example, we had a medical table, and they were there really in our planning for the exercise just to provide medical advice to all the other players. We noticed through the exercise they were engaged in frantic internal discussion because it had spun them into thinking that there were a number of critical, particularly epidemiological issues, which they had to address as medical professionals. And out of that came all kinds of things like contact between the postal control and the people who do epidemiological monitoring for the UK in North London, for example. I think the other great advantage of this kind of thing is it does build these critical relationships with the police, with the Cabinet Office, Civil Contingency Secretariat, with the Department of Health, etc., etc., etc. And we now feel the need, and this is work in progress, actually to do the same at local level for all of our management units, with the local police and so on and so forth. You asked me to sort of try and draw it together with an assessment. Under the circumstances, I don't think we did a bad job. There were many false trials, many false turns, things we had to change, things we had to improve, but overall, not a poor job. Number of things which, on reflection, I found were lacking. We tended to skip the strategic implication. I don't think that should be done by the same team as the people managing the crisis. I think it always needs people standing outside of it. But we had no one really looking at the strategic implication had an incident been real, which was much bigger in one sense than the problem of dealing with the initial contamination. Royal Mail was going through a commercial crisis at the time anyway. We had a very difficult recovery plan. You know, what would have been the effect on that? So, and we actually done it in other incidents since. We do need to put people together away from the immediate battle to think through what the strategic implication might be and what you could do to be ready for that. Already said, but I think it's worth saying again, we did underestimate how difficult it would be to embed correct reactions to a new threat at local level. And that applies, and they would admit it, both to the local police forces as well as to our own people. So that really is ongoing activity. And we should have communicated even more. I don't think you could ever say you communicate enough. It really is an issue of crucial importance, and you really need a very good communications plan, which is very carefully segmented by audience, tied in with other, particularly media handling units that are likely to be involved, to create something which doesn't hold anything back, but equally seeks to avoid panic and things like that. Key lessons. It's, I suppose, the biggest issue that's come through to me is your next crisis will certainly be different from anything you've experienced before. It was already a truism that no contingency plan's ever correctly, fully up to date. It's always just the thing you start from. So your next crisis will certainly be different from your previous experience, and in the world we now have, in the geopolitical situation we now have, is quite likely to be completely unforeseen. But the more you plan for what you can foresee, the more you practice and test, if you like, a generic crisis management capability, the more likely you are to be able to handle that unforeseen crisis as well as you possibly could. So very strong emphasis on generic processes, contacts, relationships, structures, processes, particularly as we found with this crisis, you had to draw in professionalisms who were not normally involved in crisis management, doctors, health and safety people, people like that. I think this kind of activity needs to be driven from the top and have a very clear board level message that this is important, we want everybody to cooperate. Personally, I don't think it should be led at board level operationally. I think board level people have just got too much to do, they can't give it the focus. So you need a sub-board level leader, but with a very clear remit and a very clear line into the board. Mention the need for a strategic component. Mention the need to test and practice over and over again. And don't overplan. And don't let your plans get tied into one particular scenario. Back to my granular point again. Keep it so that you can move things around and put things into different structures, and don't let them get too long and don't let them get too complicated. As a rule of thumb, if any individual has to read more than about 4 pages, it's probably too long. Because what can't you do in crisis situations? You can't read long documents. It may have to have lots of those sets of 4, provided you've got a clear framework, but no individual should need to grab much more than 2, 3, 4 pages. And if you've got things of that size, then you can keep reviewing it, keep revising it. If it's a huge over-engineered book or the electronic equivalent these days, what happens, it goes on the shelf and nobody has the time to review it. And similarly, your plans need to have these 3, 4, 5 maybe page segments at all levels, board level, national management, regional management, local senior management, operating management, so that each individual manager grabs what they need and reacts accordingly. I think the other huge lesson that came through to me was how you need to promote a proactive crisis management capability. With a vision which is something like a generic management capability, which is mainly about contacts, relationships, which can cope with the unforeseen. And does that by planning for the foreseeable and practicing and testing. And recognises that existing plans, which you need to have, but they are something to start from, rather than something you follow slavishly. Lots of dangers in trying to achieve that. There's a huge danger of lack of priority, lack of focus. What might happen is always in danger of sliding down the priority list when people have got huge other pressures. People are far too busy. Very difficult sometimes to justify it in pounds terms. How do you justify the spend? But you have to take that back through a risk model, which says preventative spend, probability of something happening, consequences of something happening. Is this not actually a reasonable investment against a catastrophic event, however remote? Companies happily pay insurance premiums for very rare events, hoping they won't happen. But actually, investing management time sometimes seems to be a bit more difficult. And there's a further difficulty which you have to manage in multi-agency environments, where you've got not only all these pressures in one organisation, we've got them in 3 or 4 organisations, all trying to do too much with too little, all with all kinds of people on their backs. The answers, as it always has to be driven from the top, and that involves government. There has to be a clear ministerial interest, and then it works its way down. There has to be, in a commercial organisation, a very clear board level remit that we will devote an adequate amount of resource to this issue. And as we said, a very hard-headed risk assessment approach. I think the other danger is you get to a tick-in-the-box mentality. Yeah, we filled in the form, we have a plan, we put it on our computers, thank you very much, we've dealt with this. Not adequate. The answer, I think, involves 2 things. One is the don't over-plan, keep it simple, keep it short, but have a regime which requires regular review. Finally, the risk of a little bit of repetition, you asked me, Patrick, just what were the half dozen key messages I'd leave? So, try to sum them up, something like this. Number 1, the next crisis will never be what you've experienced before exactly, and most likely will be unforeseen. But number 2, planning and testing for what you can foresee can produce a generic capability, which means you have a better chance of coping with that unforeseen. Planning and preparing is an ongoing process, but you do need to fight for that focus, number 3. Number 4, don't over-plan. Keep it simple, keep it granular so it's flexible, and concentrate on the processes, the relationships and the contacts. Number 5, perceptions are as important as reality, and you have to manage those, and it may well be quite separate. And number 6, communicate.
Thank you so much. And I would perhaps to add another final question. Probably when people have been trained, selected to give the best answers to normal managerial problems, when they are confronted by ignorance, something completely out of the box, somewhere there is a problem of identity. This is not me, it's not my business. I'm not in charge of that. I don't see it. So my question was, suppose one person in MIT, Harvard, Oxford, or in Paris would tell you, please, could you address our students, the future leaders of these countries, and try to open their mind to something they could be in charge of, which is not in their traditional courses. What would you say to have people in the end prepared to open, to take the lead, not to take everything, but to take a strategic view of this new challenge? What would you say?
I think you have to create a certain level of shock, and maybe one way into this is to use as case studies some of the things which have happened to companies and which have been poorly managed and have in fact dragged the company under or very badly damaged it. Exxon Valdez comes to mind. Company didn't quite go under, but it got quite dodgy. The famous suicide of a jewellery company in the United Kingdom called Ratner where the chief executive stood up and referred to his own product, and please to excuse a slightly rude word, as crap. These are the kinds of things that can happen, and that was one remark in a speech in a conference, and the company went under. So I think you can produce some historic evidence that a company can be sailing along perfectly, apparently safe as anything can be, with all the management processes, etc., etc. But a disaster can strike from any direction at any time, and unless you manage it properly, that company can be destroyed. Equally, I think you can find some case studies of similar things that have happened which have been successfully navigated. And I think you would find in those that there had been some degree of generic forethought about what happens if such and such and such a thing happens. We have a public relations disaster, or we have a major fire, or whatever the particular risk is to that particular company. So I think that's the way I would approach it. And certainly my experience with the Royal Mail Board is, if you can get the airtime, they are extremely receptive. The fight is always to get the airtime.
Airtime?
The literally time on the agenda.
Yeah.
Board meetings are very busy, an awful lot to consider. How do you make the case for taking half an hour on what might be regarded as a fairly ephemeral, ethereal issue? But if you can get it, it's actually very, very effective.
But the change, perhaps, if we compare to 10 years ago. 10 years ago, it was this occurrence's probability near zero. But now, perhaps each one is near zero. But the probability that something completely outside the box would happen in the next few years or months is very high.
I think that's true, and I think that the fight for agenda space, as it were, is helped by the fact that boards are sensitised by the change in the geopolitical situation from a Cold War situation, which was at least relatively stable, to something which is much more fluid. Issues like global warming have got them much more sensitised to these kinds of issues, and it is the kinds of things which are starting to turn into governance questions. It is the sorts of things which major shareholders are starting to ask questions about, and of course insurers are starting to say, well, if you want cover against these rather indeterminate risks, show me how you're going to, in the insurance jargon, mitigate them. Show me what your plan is. So I think it's easier. I don't think it's, or less difficult, perhaps one should say. It's certainly not easy, but there are growing environmental issues, as it were, which mean that boards are much more sensitised to this kind of thing, as are indeed governments.
So let's go to work.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Patrick.